Howdy again everyone, and let's get straight into this one. Here we have the TTArtisan 50mm f1.4. It costs a little over £200 in the UK, or about $250 US, and it's a full frame lens for mirrorless camera systems only. So that's Leica M mount cameras, L mount and Sony E mount cameras, Nikon Z and Canon RF mount cameras. Any 50mm lens on a full frame camera will make itself incredibly useful to you with its versatile focal length and beautifully out of focus backgrounds, if you can get it in focus, of course. This is a totally manual lens, manual focus and manual aperture. I'd like to thank TTArtisan for sending me a copy of this new lens for testing, although as usual this is a totally independent review. I'll be looking at its strengths and its weaknesses. The lens itself is fairly small, despite the fact it has a more complex optical formula than traditional 50mm optics with 10 glass elements inside it, so it does feel quite weighty actually. The build quality is tough and metallic, feeling nice to handle, although it's not weather sealed. The focus ring is made of metal and turns extremely smoothly, as you can see. It's not the most precise I've ever handled, but with care, focusing at f1.4 is not a problem. As you can see here, the lens demonstrates some pretty strong focus breathing. At the front of the lens comes the aperture ring. It turns with some nice gentle clicks to it at every half a stop of aperture, and the aperture points are evenly spaced out, which is very nice to see. The lens doesn't come with a hood, unfortunately, but it does have a slip-on lens cap that fits on pretty securely. Overall, the build quality of this lens is very solid, and it handles well enough. It's really quite typical for a fully manual Chinese lens, but do remember, manually focusing any lens at f1.4 on a full frame camera is always going to take a little practice. Let's take a look at its image quality. As it's intended for full frame cameras, and there are plenty of other cheap 50mm aps-c lenses out there, I'll just be testing this one on a full frame camera, my 42MP Sony a7R III. In-camera corrections are not available for this lens. At f1.4, in the middle of the image, picture quality is decently sharp, but contrast is low, and there's a lot of purple fringing to be seen there. The corner image quality is a little softer, with very low contrast, probably caused by chroma smearing. Stop down to f2, and the corner image quality clears up a little, but is still hardly impressive, and back in the middle, we now see a very sharp image though. Stop down to f2.8 and the middle looks perfect, and the corners look a lot sharper now, although contrast there is still low. Stop down to f4 for a further improvement, and at f5.6 those corners look excellent. They stay this sharp down to f11, where diffraction is beginning to take its toll and soften the image a little. Overall, this is a bog standard performance for a 50mm lens really, very similar to that produced by a traditional double gauze design, although perhaps with just a little more contrast. There's nothing special going on here, although you do get great sharpness if you stop down to f4. Let's see about vignetting and distortion now. As you can see, the lens projects quite some noticeable pincushion distortion, and at f1.4, vignetting is very heavy. Stop down to f2 or f2.8 to see those corners brighten up, but this is as bright as they get, so again, not a great performance here. The lens can focus down to 50cm, a bit further than average for a 50mm optic. At f1.4, close-up image quality looks really washed out, although there is at least still some resolution to be seen. Stop down to f2 and contrast makes a big return, leading to very good image quality. At f2.8, close-up sharpness is excellent. Let's see how the lens performs against bright light. We see plenty of flaring and glaring here. Although the general contrast in the background remains okay, this is still a poor performance. While we're working in the dark, let's take a look at chroma levels. At f1.4 they are pretty extreme. Bright points of light in the image corners see plenty of chroma smearing. At f2 it's reduced, and at f2.8 it's virtually gone. Let's zoom out a little and see about sun stars. You have to stop down to f5.6 to see them begin to emerge. Stop down to f11 and they get really nice and strong. Finally, bokeh. So far, this lens has performed a bit poorly, but one of its strengths is the quality of its out-of-focus backgrounds, which almost always looked lovely and soft to me, so that's one brownie point at least. Overall, there's just no disguising that this lens really isn't a very good optical performer for all the reasons I've just covered, well, except for its bokeh. For £200, I don't think its image quality is good enough to tempt people away from choosing to get an autofocus f1.8 50mm lens instead, which both Sony and Canon offer on their respective systems.